There was myself, two of my older brothers, and three of my older sisters.
I really think I was 4 years old, but they had me down for 7 going on 8. Because I was so young that I only went to school in the morning and then I had to take a nap in the afternoon.
They came into the house and took the children and loaded them on boxcars and then wagons and hauled them to the boarding schools. And the parents, in a lot of cases, didn't know where they went, and many of the women, it was said when they took the children from the home, they sang the child's death song, because they knew that that child, when that child came home, would never be the same again.
My grandfather went to Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, and my grandmother went to Mount Pleasant Industrial School here in Mount Pleasant. And they were both from the same very tiny village, and that's another aspect that we've noticed, is that the people from one village might be dispersed to a lot of different schools. It wasn't like everyone from this village went to this school.
I'm here to talk about Mount Pleasant Boarding School. I have 7 family members that passed through the school. My grandfather and his sister, and they came into Mount Pleasant Boarding School, and then they shipped them on to Carlisle. And then in my father's generation, he and 2 brothers and 2 sisters attended. And I want to talk about the impact on our family.
My mom's picture, I would like to show you my mom's picture. This was taken when my mom was about 89 years old. I love my mom. She was a hard worker. Someone asked me one time if my mom, because she had raised 3 children, was she a good parent? How did her parenting skills affect my parenting skills? And I laughed. I just laughed out loud. I said, my mother had no parenting skills. She went to an Indian boarding school. She went to Mount Pleasant, and when she was quite young, probably 9 or 10, she was put on a train with many other Indian children, and they were taken to Haskell, Kansas, to the industrial Indian boarding school in Haskell, Kansas, and that's where she stayed until she was probably 17 or 18 and graduated. I don't know if that's the word they used, but until she was finished with her education there, and then she came back to Michigan. But they didn't teach Indian children how to be parents. They taught them how to be domestics and bakers and farmers and servants.
This policy of taking Indian children from their families reflected the ethos of colonialism and the feeling that white culture was superior to Native American culture. Today this would be regarded as a gross violation of human rights, because Native parents had no say in what happened to their children.
President Andrew Jackson made it mandatory that every Indian child attend boarding school.
That it was required by law during that time. You have to send your kids to school up to a certain age.
These children, instead of being raised in a warm, loving home, a supportive home, were raised in institutions that were emotionally void, that were uncaring, where there was no love and no support and no lasting relationships.
The mission school became your family. Everything that your family would have provided in a normal, natural sense was provided by the mission school with their tactics, their torture, so that is I think the breakup of that traditional family, that relationship you had with your extended family.
All these boarding schools, I believe there was over 560 of them at one time. They were all under contract to the federal government. And it didn't matter whether they were government operated. There was only 26 of those. All the rest of them most of them were all religious, run by different religious organizations. And it didn't matter what their beliefs were. Their main objective was the same one that was introduced at Carlisle under government policy, and that was kill the Indian but save the human.
In Native American societies, children were taught to think for themselves but always act for the good of the group. When they got to the boarding schools, there was a different philosophy, and that philosophy was to act like the group, and uniformity was what was being valued, so that the children could be easily manipulated, and because they were being trained for these low-level menial jobs, they were not supposed to question the authority, and they were not supposed to question their bosses later on in life.
And they worked us. They worked us all day. And at night they put us upstairs in a bedroom, and that was it. And we shared a dormitory. And
you lined up and to do everywhere you went in that facility, you did it in lines, you did it in order, and it was, and I recognize that's how the military was run. So I mean, when you went to eat, when you went to school, you did it in lines and formations, and basically the discipline itself was very, very harsh. And from my earliest recollections, I mean, there was constant beatings that went on.
We were still not smart enough, even if we made a A or a B in a course, you know, and everything we did was criticized, and we were yelled at, slapped, like I tell the story of in the 3rd grade asking the teacher, a sister, I raised my hand and asked her why was she teaching that Columbus discovered America when Indians were there first, were here first. And she came over and slapped me across my face and then made me stand in the corner. To me it was a long time, if it was half hour, but to be humiliated in front of the class, I'll never forget that.
And she looked and she said, you know, one time we were lined up for dinner. We were all in a row. The girls were in one line and the boys were in another. And one of the boys pushed, like young children will do, and one of the other boys pushed back and said something quick in his Indian language. That's how she said it, in his Indian language. And the schoolmaster was close enough so that he grabbed him by the hair and he pulled him out of line, and she said he threw him on the floor, and he was yelling at the boy, and he kicked him down the stairwell. And I said, "You were on the 3rd floor?" She says, "Yes." And we were waiting to go down those stairs, but he kicked that boy, and he went down on the landing, and he kicked him again. And he kicked him so that he went down to the next landing. And I said, "Was the boy making any noise?" And she said, I can't remember. All I can remember is the schoolmaster yelling and yelling. And he kicked him again, and we couldn't see him anymore. And I said, "What happened to the boy?" And she said, "Oh," and she shook her head like she was coming out of a dream, and she says, "Oh, I can't remember. I don't know. I don't know that I ever saw him again." So I put the car in gear and started to pull away, and she says, "But you know," and she turned around and she looked over her shoulder across the field, and she said, "You know, there's a cemetery out there in that woods. There's this little cemetery." And that's all she said.
It was a big, great big facility, common dormitory, and they had rows of bunks, double-decker, triple-decker bunks lined up. And again, the black robes, Shinasapa as they refer to, would walk around between those aisles with long rods, wooden rods, and they would listen for sounds, and if they heard a sound, and I participated in these drills at least 3-4 times, but they would turn on all the lights, they would start blowing these whistles, and everyone would have to get out of their beds and kneel down in these aisles in rows facing each other, and then they would say, "Arms out," and you'd put your arms out like that, and they would say, "Forward," and then you'd start rotating your arms. I mean, you see little kids doing this, and then you'd start rotating your arms, and then they would say, "Backwards," and so you'd start rotating your arms backwards, and they would walk around behind you, and if you started getting tired and your arms start going down, then that's when the beatings start coming. I mean, they would start whacking your arms like that.
If they felt that we were disobedient, they kept the bag full of beans, dry beans, kidney beans, and they pull your hair and then say, "Go kneel down on those beans." It was horrible.
They had a strap. It had no buckles on it. It was just a strap, and they'd put you over the bed and whip you up there over it.
If you were playing out at the playground and you passed a certain line, then you were running away. You were running away from the school. Whether you were running away or not, you passed the line, so you were running away. So they'd bring you in, they'd take you upstairs, and this guy, then he had a different method. He had a leather strap, a razor strap that was at least 3 feet long, and depending on how far you went past that line, that would determine the severity of your punishment. So if you went like 10 feet past that line, then you got 10 strokes of that leather strap. and if you went like 100 feet, then you had to drop your drawers and get those 10 swats with on your bare butt.
Like the one winter, and I believe it was my birthday, and there was new snow out there, and we had trampled all ours, and we were looking over the fence, and the snow was not trampled on the other side. And we went across, and just for going over the fence, they took us all, and maybe so many of us, they put us 3 across the bed at once. The straps. And the girlfriend I told you about, we learned by then, you know, we don't cry. I don't know, I can cry now, but I couldn't at the time. We'd fake it. We learned to tolerate this spanking.
I left and kept running away. Of course, every time they brought me back, they put you in the hospital, check you out to make sure you're okay. But when they picked you up, they would take you through an elevator that went up to the second floor, and they would stop the elevator, and they'd beat the shit out of you. They would just, with their fists. You know, these are grown men beating a young kid. I was always small. I was very small, so they were just, so by the time I got off the elevator, I really needed the hospital. And it's kind of funny now, but it wasn't funny then.
When we were younger, when we first went there, and they were lining us up in the lines to go to chow, we called it chow, and we were marching in line, and the lines went up into the chow hall, past the pots, and you'd pick your bowls up in the front, and then you'd step forward like that, just as you were served. Then the other guys would, at the front of the line, would go sit down. So you marched up and you carried your bowl, and no talking. You could not talk while you were in that line. And again, we had these black robes walking back and forth to enforce that, to make sure that you adhere to that discipline. And one time, and this sticks with me all the time, because I can if I voluntarily recall that, I can still hear, you know, the sounds that were created by that experience. But one of my cousins, and his name, I don't know if I should use names in here, but his name was Bootsy Quiverdick, and that was a nickname. Everybody had nicknames then, but Bootsy they called him, and Quiver was his last name. And he was one of my relatives, which I didn't know until I got older. But they actually took he had these big pots that they cooked the food in, and that they'd haul in from the kitchen itself and set in the dining room on tables, and they only set up about that high, but they took his hand because they heard him talking, and they took his bare hand and they pressed it up against one of these pots, and that is the first time I've seen something like that happen. And I don't know, you know, maybe it happened all the time, but because he was right in front of me, it impacted me, because the screams that a 4 or 5 year old boy, you know, he put his hand on a boiling pot and you could tell he was burning, and he was screaming, and they just held it there. They just held his hand there, and those screams that he was, you know, I couldn't understand that.
Mount Pleasant Indian School had they called it an apparition because they never gave credibility to the complaints that the young girls, but the young girls talked about this man. He used to be a maintenance man on grounds, and at night he would go through the girls' dorms and rape these young girls. And they would go up to the administrative offices to complain, and they would say, well, it's just your imagination because you're at the age where you're passing through puberty, and so your imagination is just that, you know. And my auntie was the older auntie was one of the victims of that, and she lived a large part of her life as a prostitute because she had learned in the boarding school that she could gain favors she could gain things by sexual favors.
She was very severely sexually abused. In this case, it was a Catholic boarding school. And there's a lot of standing in lines that happened in boarding school. You'll see pictures of the children in lines quite frequently. And there was a lot of marching like they were soldiers or like they were in military camps. they would stand in line to go to confession. If anyone's been raised as a Catholic, you know what that is, which is where you go and confess your sins to the priest. And the nuns would routinely pick her out of the line, and she never knew why. Now this lady, even in her late 50s, was very beautiful. And I think that her physical beauty may have had something to do with it, but that's only a hypothesis. She would be selected, and she would be taken. They said, "You're so bad that you have to talk to the priest, personally." So they would take her to another room where the priest was, and there she would be sexually abused. And this went on. She went when she was probably about 3 years old, and it started at a very young age, and it went on for years. And I worked with her therapeutically. She was in therapy with me for a long time. She had had a history of very severe substance abuse. She had been in domestic violence situations, was used to being victimized, has kind of been trained in that role. Again, what did they internalize at the boarding school? In her case, it was this victim role. And what else could she be? She was helpless at age 5 or whatever age this started. But in one of her therapy sessions, she had a very painful recollection of the priest, after he was finished, giving her some pennies. He reached into his robe and gave her some pennies. And other times he would give her a piece of candy. And when she remembered that in therapy, she was so humiliated, because it felt to her as though that was her payment for participating in this.
There was widespread physical and sexual abuse in the boarding schools. Children died in the boarding schools, and many times their families were not even notified of their death. They are in unmarked graves on the grounds of residential boarding schools across the United States and Canada, in addition to marked graves at various schools as well.
And she remembered some friends. But there again, there was that. There's a cemetery. And one of my dear friends died. And I said, was she hurt? Was she sick? No. And she hung her head and she said, she had an abortion. And, oh my goodness, when I was 15, that was in the 50s, and I said, she had an abortion? She says, yes. It was self-inflicted, and she bled to death. And she was so young, and I felt bad. And that's why she would never talk about those things. It was things I think that she just blocked out of her mind, and she moved on. I've always said my mom was a survivor. She was a survivor. And every time I hear about children that go to the Indian boarding schools, they're all survivors. Some people will say, that was a good time. That was a good time in my life. And I look at them and I wonder, but then I know that they didn't have a family. They didn't have, they were better off sometimes because they didn't have food and they didn't have clothes and they didn't have whatever. But my mom had a family. She had a language. She had a culture.
A parent raised in a boarding school had no modeling for parental behavior. They didn't learn to parent because they were parented by an institution. They were standing in lines when they should have been getting hugs. They had no emotional support. They were cleaning and working and scrubbing and farming and basically taking care of the institution, which became a mechanism to raise money for these various religious orders.
The Catholic Charities in the old days would literally rewrite who you were for two reasons. They had girls living there that were getting pregnant. That at that time it was terrible. It was a horrible thing for a young girl to get pregnant, and babies would disappear. Their records would disappear. My records disappeared. We actually found out where they could be, and we went there to get them, and have never really found my records. They just did what they wanted to do. They just did.
In terms of the disruption of parenting skills, because these were run sort of on a militaristic model, there was a lot of shouting of orders, there were bells, there were standing in lines, marching, and so these generations of our people who went through this were raised in a militaristic fashion. And so they don't know, you know, I won't say everyone is this way, but many don't know any other way to talk to children. And this grandmother, great-grandmother, is one of those people. So when something needs to be done, she yells at the kids. There's no soft, gentle, you know, oh honey, could you come over here for a minute? You're not going to hear that. And yet the love is shown through the fact that she feeds them. They come to her home. They're safe. No one's going to take them away. She gives them chores to do and expects them to do it. Kind of runs it like a boarding school in a way. But she has kept these children, in her mind, safe. They're not being sexually abused. And she doesn't hit them. So there's like levels of ability to parent that have been greatly disrupted.
I had said that my mother had little, if any, parenting skills, and I think that's a very, very good, very strong assumption, very true, that the boarding school system, and it was alive and well, in the late 50s yet even. I know people here on the reservation that said that they attended boarding school, and they're only in their 40s, that they attended boarding school yet. But to think that you just automatically assimilate how to be a parent and how to guide your children and how to form their characters, that's a really big assumption. And I think that the boarding school had a really big impact on the lack of character building and how to pass that strength onto the next generation, onto your children. And when they don't have that strength of character within themselves, nor do they have a mentor to look back on, it's sad.
But for causing me to carry it down to my children, it hurts. Because I see the results through my children, you know. I never wanted to put them through that. No. And I've apologized to them.
Many came out, I'm sorry to say, became alcoholics, drug addicts, prostitutes, because when you come out of a place like what you were raised in like that, like with me, I came out, my dad picked me up, and I just said, world, here I am.
Intergenerational trauma is trauma that is not resolved in the generation where it's found. And as a result, that trauma is passed on from one generation to the next and contributes to the problems that we see in many societies today.
Part of what I saw was that the heavy discipline and the beatings that he endured became kind of part of who he was. even though in many ways he was a very gentle and loving, kind grandfather, his firstborn son was very almost savagely treated. And this had an effect on the firstborn son of making him violent. And so even though he didn't himself go to boarding school, you see how there's that intergenerational transmission of one person's manifestation of internalizing what the boarding school had to offer. So that then it played out in his own relationship with his son. And then when that son grew up and got married, he also, until he got older and some things changed in his life, he too was a very violent person. So we don't know that that violence would have been there had the grandfather not gone to Carlisle. So that's an example of an intergenerational manifestation of trauma.
After many of these children left the boarding schools, they didn't fit in white mainstream society, and they didn't fit in their tribal societies at home. So they felt they didn't belong anywhere. As a result of that kind of feeling about themselves, we have a suicide rate that's 2.5 times the national average.
Part of boarding school was to disenfranchise Indians from their land and from their identity. And not only to disenfranchise you from your identity, but to denigrate your identity, so that some of these phrases that we've all heard that are so stereotypical, dumb Indian, those things were said to make our people hate who we are, take away our identity as Indian people. And of course we all know that to speak one word of the language resulted in very severe punishment. So there was a very consistent over all the schools curriculum against speaking any indigenous language, no matter what tribe you came from. And that, as we all know, had the effect of, in 2 generations, making the fluent speakers of our language kind of a rarity. Now, some communities do have a lot of fluent speakers still, but a lot of our communities are and have been working to bring our languages back and to develop fluency in our children so that our languages won't be lost completely.
You look back and say that shouldn't have happened, because I've also went through all these drinking problems and not so much drugs, but most of it was drinking, that experience, that life. But I don't think it was a large part of it. But not everybody went to the mission schools, but they're still, they still have the drinking. So it's that society as a whole that was traumatic for the people that existed here, the populations and that existed on this land before the colonizers came. And I think in order for us to be able to find a balance in that, I think we need to understand where we come from, because whether we recognize it or not, that is what is allowing us to survive. That our recognition of our tribal ways gives us that strength.
But the grief part of knowing that there was a life that was better than this one that I'm living now, that there was a world that was better than this one that I'm living in now, and realizing the role that Mount Pleasant Indian School played in taking that away, forbidding us to speak our language and practice our ways. But I'm glad today to be able to say that I can go to Sweat Lodge ceremony, and that I can dance with my people, and that I can smoke my pipe, and I can play my flute and sing those songs, and I can be with my people and be accepted, and the most interesting thing about all of this is having decided at some point that my world was going to get worse or it was going to get better, and I was going to have to make the transition, and then working in the field of historical trauma and the boarding school issues. And then I remembered a teaching that an elder gave. He said, when you open the door of your understanding, the teachers will come. And the teachers begin to come when I opened that door of transition. And I begin to learn, and I begin to absorb things. And also, I like something John Trudell said one time. He said, if you're a member of the red race, he said, it doesn't matter how far away from your people that you've lived. He said, it's in your DNA.
It took a while for me to do that, to understand that. But again, at this point in my life, I can look back on all this abuse and torture, and I've created a balance for it, because it no longer is able to, I'm able to, even although there was anger and resentment and what a part of our society, or the American society, referred to as radicalism and revolutionary system, is just an acceptance of my own way. And my Tanshi, Leonard Crodon, who's a very well-respected Wakanwi Chasha, or interpreter, Wakanyeska, back in our country, is, he said, we should have been praying with these people when they first got off the Mayflower. We should have started teaching them our ceremonies. Instead of hiding from them, we should have started praying with them. And then maybe that understanding would have been there.
And I like something that a brother of mine by the name of F. Browning Pipestem shared one time. He said, I reach back 7 generations and I have a hold of the hands of the ancestors. And he said, I'm reaching forward 7 generations, that generation coming, and I'm making history today. And all the great songs haven't been sung, and all the great works haven't been done yet. And so we have a lot of work to do. And addressing issues like Mount Pleasant Boarding School is a part of that work.